in the ongoing efforts to try to help awareness about the, I'm going to say, insanity and the un-American, anti-American agenda that's being promoted and perpetuated in the mental health profession. Today, I'm hosting a conversation between two ladies that have a lot of information about what's going on in the counseling programs and where this stuff is coming from the associations, all of this stuff. So I'm really looking forward to this. Like I said, the discussion is mainly going to be between my guests today, Katie Kernodle and Suzannah Alexander, and I'm going to basically just turn it over to them and let them have their discussion. I'll be kind of hanging out and listening in, and might be asking some questions here and there for my own clarification and understanding. But so Katie and Suzannah, thanks for being here and having this conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much, Paul. So just to introduce myself, my name is Katie Kernodle. I'm a licensed associate counselor and a clinical therapist. I first met Suzannah through a panel with Leslie Elliott Boyce. And people had just been telling me all the time, I need to talk to Suzannah. When I first encountered her work, it was really wonderful for me because it was the first time that I saw somebody see some of the same things that I was seeing and articulating it so superbly. So I wanted to have this conversation and just kind of interview Suzannah, get a little bit of information as to, her history, some of the work that she's doing, and things that I think could be useful for us to talk about, especially for the public with respect to the situation in counseling. So Suzannah, if you want to tell us a little bit about yourself and just what you're doing right now.
Well, I come at this from having gone back to university to become a counselor, and I was a student at the University of Tennessee, and I made it one semester and found the program. I found the pedagogy style, particularly where they want to bring students forward and make you confess things in front of the class. This was, in my opinion, mildly abusive. And I was called out for my Buddhist practice, which was seen as invalidating to other identities, because the focus of that is to not focus on yourself. That's the central practice of Buddhism. It's the doctrine of the non-self. It's to not think about yourself so that you can think about others. And needless to say, I did not do well. I mean, my grades were great. I had great grades. But in terms of navigating the ideological material that they wanted me to absorb, I was not absorbing it. I was reacting against it. And by the end of the semester, I left, and I'm very glad to not be in that program, but it changed the way that I look at universities. I was seeing things that I had never expected to see in a university, and it set me down a path where I started digging into the history of where this had come from. I knew that what I was experiencing was so unhealthy and out of the ordinary that it had to have been supported by the structure of the school and elements outside of the school for a long time in order for it to get that way. And so I started investigating that and writing about that. And, it's just the more I dig, the more I find that the hole just goes deeper and deeper and deeper. And now I spent the last year working on my Substack, writing about all of the things that I found. And I'm in the process of moving to become one of the National Association of Scholars and to continue this investigation and to push for reform in our universities with them.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate you sharing your background. I'm wondering, when you initially decided to pursue going back to UT, what was your motivation or your interest specifically in counseling?
Well, that came from, I was in the process of getting divorced. I had just gotten divorced, and I had spent the prior 20 so years being a stay-at-home parent. In the process of that, the parenting skills that I learned, I thought put me in a good position to work on that. And then the breakup of the marriage itself was its own difficulty and had put me into therapy for a number of years. And I came out of it with definitely a much better understanding of how people worked and a curiosity about how people worked and how you can help them and how you can manage very difficult situations. And I thought that that would be a logical step from what I had experienced trying to raise my kids, creating a space for them to be themselves, even when they are difficult. Let's say sometimes raising kids can be very difficult and pressurizing. And I thought that, the skills that I had learned in that would be a natural forerunner to being a counselor. And that's how I started down on that path.
Okay, so getting divorced and having the experience of raising children, going to therapy, it sounds like kind of led you towards the going to school for counseling and kind of pursuing that as a career. I'm wondering too what your expectations were when you first started the program as to what the content would look like, what the culture would be.
Well, I was actually really very excited because in the lead up to it, I had really gotten very interested in psychology. I did a lot of reading, and particularly, I guess, maybe things coming out from the 80s to the 2000s. Read a lot of Otto Kernberg and Diane Diamond, and I was familiar with dialectical behavioral therapy, acceptance and commitment therapy, which was the variety that I imagined that I would be working under, just generally speaking. And I was super excited to learn more about psychology. And when we first started the class, we went through a little orientation and stuff, and the professors suggested to us that we should consider this classroom to be a brave space. And when I heard that, the terminology that I had been listening to over the years was talking about safe spaces and the problems with safe spaces. And I thought, wow, this is great. I will not have to worry about some of the more indoctrinating situations that I had heard of just at a distance. I really was very much outside of the loop, but I hear little bits here and there. And so I was very excited about that and looking forward to learn, and definitely looking forward to getting started on what I had hoped would be a new chapter for me, and moving back into the workforce and out of out of being a stay-at-home parent.
Yeah, and when you did get there and started going through the classes, how was the difference between what you were expecting and how it kind of ended up being?
Well, what I picked up on, fairly quickly is that there was a little bit of a tension, and from the point of view that I was coming at it from, at least at first, it seemed like it was more from the students, really just like one or two in particular. Like when I first talked about, it was in the context of, how do you control your feelings when you're being challenged by a client, or, you're in a situation where you need to stay calm. The other person is coming at you perhaps in a very angry or overwhelming way. And, I shared that when and this is one of the beauties of the Buddhist practice, is when you reduce your focus on yourself and you're just focusing on what's going on with the other person, it's relatively straightforward to do that. You really kind of take yourself out of the equation, and it's fairly easy to stay calm. And one of the other students kind of snapped that, that it was a privilege to not be able to think about your identity. And like at the time, I just, I clocked that was a strange response. And they didn't quite, understand what was underlying that, but it seemed like that particular person took issue with that. But it wasn't until the end of class when my professor came up and, said that, that wasn't really a healthy practice, and that, that it would be invalidating to other identities, and I should really, think about maybe reconsidering that, which just kind of boggled my mind. It's like it just didn't make any sense, and it made me think, because talking about some of the details in Buddhism and meditation it can come across a little esoteric. So I just assumed that I probably hadn't explained it very well. And then, as time went by, I just doubled down trying to explain it better. It's like, well, it's like, because it never occurred to me that one of the underlying philosophies under dialectical behavioral therapy and acceptance and commitment therapy would be considered in any way out of bounds. My assumption was that the professors would, of course, know about Buddhism and how much it has been interwoven with a lot of therapy. And so it made so little sense to me, because for me to have, really taken in what they were saying, I would have to assume that they just didn't know what they were talking about. Like they didn't know their job, or they were being actively malicious. And I don't typically jump to those conclusions about people. And so, it definitely threw me through a loop. It took me a while to get to a place where by the end of the semester, I felt like they were actively being malicious. That was where I was at.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that. Like this tracks a lot with my experience, what you're describing. I did not go to a K-Prep school. I went to an MPCAC school, but it's functionally very similar. Our curriculum is basically following K-Prep in order so that we can get licensed. But like what you're saying about, at first, it seems like it was only a couple of people, and then you kind of slowly but surely realize that it's foundational in the curriculum and in the professors. So I'm wondering at what point the shift happened, maybe where it moved from like, this is a very specific, like, a specific professor, a specific class, interpersonal difficulty, to this is in the curriculum, to this is more of like a top down, like philosophical thing being like put upon these programs from the top down from the accrediting bodies. I'm wondering if that happened.
Well, the way that it worked, at least as far as my shift in the scope of it, is by the middle of the semester, I was called into my advisor's office, and I was then told that my thinking was too concrete and that I was transphobic, and that I needed to correct those problems or I would be put on a support plan. And, when I asked what examples of, my concrete thinking were, it was from where I had questioned things in my ethics class and in another class. When I was, in ethics class, you're given these little scenarios that you're supposed to work through and create an ethical framework of how you would respond as a clinician. And when I questioned some of the assumptions that were underlying the premise that we were handed, that was considered being too concrete. And concrete thinking was being labeled as a problem. And it was at that point I knew that I was in trouble. Something was not right. I also, was absolutely baffled that I was being labeled as transphobic, because I had been in the Knoxville Pride Parade just, like 2 years prior. I knew that I wasn't, and so it just did not make any sense. And I wasn't even sure how to change to remedy these situations, because it just didn't make sense. And as the time progressed after that, there was an incident in my group's class where there was, it was basically an organized confrontation. And, without getting into the details of what was said, the other group members were put in a position where they were all confronting me about things that I was thinking, or they perceived that I was thinking or saying. And after that, I recognized that there was no way that I was going to get through this program if I didn't have some support. So I reached out for a support plan. I was still at that point thinking that this might actually be supportive. And what I discovered when I got into the support plan is it was just, every other week sessions where I was pressured to change my values. And my Buddhist practice was, in particular called out. And, I was told that I needed to accept these values. And by the end, I was called in 5 days before Christmas. I was told that my thinking at that point was too legalistic, and that I was also obviously racist because I had talked about when I had gotten my undergraduate degree in Greensboro, having gone to the Woolworths and seen the counter where the protest had happened, that just talking about that was racist. And because of the way the prior weeks had been and the obvious pressurizing had been, I recognized at that point that my professors really weren't invested in me. And when I had tried to speak up for myself and just share my perspective, I was repeatedly cut off. And so at that point I said, I can't defend myself from these accusations without being labeled defensive. And it was clear that they had put me in a double bind, and they knew that, and it was intentional. So I left the program after that, and I was an absolute wreck for the next several months, because I was now indebted for the expense of going back for a master's degree. I was not on a pathway to get started on a career. I had no idea where I was going or what I was going to do. And I had just come through a difficult divorce and had gone through this really horrible, traumatic experience. And it was in the things that I did in that period that started to make me think that there was something bigger going on. Because one of the ways that I tried to work my way through these terrible emotions that I was feeling was by writing little fairy tales. And I caught myself after writing a few of them, and I'm looking at these things and I'm like, why am I trying to rewrite Animal Farm? And that was when kind of a light bulb went off, and I recognized there's something, this cannot be just all on its own. It's an indoctrination program. There's, it couldn't exist in the way that it is being performed without other parts of the university buying into that. And when I had come out, even in my horrible state, I had filed complaints. I filed a complaint with the university. I filed a complaint with KCREP, saying, hey, you're supposed to be making sure that these programs are safe and healthy for students. And this is what I'm experiencing. And both of those got dismissed. And that made absolutely no sense to me. And after I made my videos, I just had a sense that I needed to figure out how the field had gotten that way. How did a psychology-based profession, which is supposed to be training people to help each other and to be open with each other, how did it get to a program where you're actively humiliating trainees in the training program? That was just an absolute disconnect for me. That didn't make any sense, and there had to be a reason for that. And that's when I started digging into the history of K-Crep and how the profession had become ideological. And I found some documents at the American Counseling Association website. And then I just started looking in their bibliographies and tracking down those documents. And that's when I started to put together a picture of what was going on there. And it was written straight from the late 80s that what they wanted was for this to be a program that required a belief in multiculturalism from the students, and that should be applied to the clients, which is just wildly unethical. So that, at that point, I'm like, whoa, this goes back a long way, and it's already built in. What they're creating is something that is unethical. That's what was desired.
Mm-hmm.
If I could jump in just for a second and just ask two quick questions. One is, as an adult going back to school, to get your master's degree, certified in a new area and things like that, what was the general age of the other students in the program, number one? And number two, did you feel like either early on or at some point that you were being recognized as somebody by the professors, as somebody who's not going to be going along with this indoctrination program, and then maybe, targeted for, let's say a little bit of a pressure campaign to have you removed from the program? So I guess the thing would be the ages of the other students, and did you feel like, there was an early target that, okay, this one's not going along with the program no matter what happens, we're going to work on her?
Yeah, well, I was, far and away, older than the vast majority of the other students. I was the only one that had children. There were one or two that had just been married. I had been, married, raised children, had a divorce, and the vast majority of the students were in their 20s, really fresh from their undergraduate experience, and didn't really have the life experience to have figured out really where they wanted to put themselves in terms of their own values in life. They hadn't really had those kind of things tested. And as far as the targeting, I didn't really recognize that I was being targeted until later on. After I had that meeting with my advisor, I started to realize that I felt like I was the problem student. And it wasn't until after I had come out of the program and I started to learn about what critical theories are, what they meant by multicultural counseling and how these ideological elements worked and functioned, that I could look back and see what it was that they took issue with what I was saying. And at that point, I realized that, yes, I probably was targeted fairly early in the experience, because the things that I was doing and saying were wildly contradictory to that. I mean, there was one experience that we had in the University of Tennessee. The way that they organize their program is that they have what they call their chorus values. And these are, values that they think that the program should encourage in the students. Things like commitment, humility, self-awareness, that sort of thing. But they filter them all through the critical theories lens. So what you might think of as self-awareness, what they're talking about is, if you're a white person, are you aware that you're a white person and that you are a privileged oppressor? That's the kind of self-awareness that they want. And I was thinking, self-awareness, what are my, character goals, and what are my shortcomings, and that sort of thing. And so the things that I was bringing up were obviously undermining that. And in one of those chorus discussions, they talked about, or they wanted people to talk about experiences where they may have, acted in a racist way, or, experienced something like that. And, I was alive back in the 70s in the South, yeah, of course, we saw some of that. And I had talked about reaching out to one of my classmates from when I grew up, and, just addressing those kind of questions. And that it was a very powerful moment, and there was like mutual forgiveness about how in the 1970s, when we were growing up, that environment kind of drew people to be more focused on those identity issues than we had reached in a point. And that was called out by my professors as not okay. Like, you should not try to reach out to somebody you had wronged in the past and try to make amends, or to have forgiveness, or create that kind of reconciliation. And, looking at it through what they're trying to do, that runs counter to what they're trying to do. They want there to be this climate of continual subjugation. If you are white, you will always be wrong. You can never not be racist. And so those kinds of things that I was saying, that to me are a matter of course, of course you want to try and reconcile. That's even what good psychology and therapy will encourage you to do. But that's not ideologically what they're looking for, and that's what they were teaching us. I mean, in our skills class, we were being encouraged to draw the conversation around to race, so that we could talk about how, well, I am if you look at this wheel thing that they have to figure out whether you're privileged or marginalized, and then you could say to your client, well, I'm a privileged white person and you're not, and you're never going to be. And I guess I'm supposed to feel bad about that, rather than in trying to connect and to have a rapport. It's just, it's just antithetical to things that are actually helpful. But that's kind of how it worked out for me, is that I was being targeted because I was saying a lot of things that were running counter to what they were trying to instill. And I just didn't recognize it because I didn't have experience with that ideology outside of that classroom, not in that kind of intensity.
Yeah, so something that I wanted to just kind of highlight or point out from what Suzannah is discussing here is specifically like almost like the cult dynamics. And I'm wondering, Suzannah, if maybe like you can relate to that feeling or that vibe or that observation. But like for example, getting people in debt, it's kind of like a little bit of a buy-in, and it becomes increasingly difficult for people who are in debt to um take back or like change their minds. So like what you did, Susanna, takes principle, and especially for people who are like 23 years old and don't have the life experience or like the cemented values in order to understand how important it is, are just going to be more likely to kind of go along with things, go along with getting the licenses and playing the game in order to to not have all of that time and money lost. You also have things like forcing people to share. So everyone, like this was my experience too, in like group dynamics or in various classes, they were like heavily they're less academic than they should have been in many cases, and a lot of like oversharing and having people kind of like I mean, I consider it a cult dynamic because you're put in a position where you're pressured to like share personal things, and those things could be used against you, especially if they're going to do things like struggle sessions and the like. I'm also thinking, for example, of the thought reform that you were forced to undergo or expected to undergo in order to keep your position at the school. So all of those things, I think, kind of signal a cult dynamic that is downstream from the fact that critical consciousness and like critical social justice are foundational to the professional standards. So this like wheel of privilege and oppression, this is something that's present in the it's the ACA endorsed and like HACREP, I think, adopted social justice and multicultural competencies. So it has things like counselor self-awareness, learning and unlearning your privilege, all of the things that you're describing are embedded into these professional standards. And when you have something like critical consciousness as like a formal standard, it creates a situation where like more like people that can play the Marxist game rise to the top. So if you can say the right things and I mean, participate in these sessions, these struggle sessions, and do the right reflections, which I mean, I think is a little bit pathological. So it basically creates a situation very common in cults where the most pathological people rise to the top. So I'm wondering, like, moving from your university experience to maybe your policy work, because I know you've done a lot, like specifically on accreditation, and it sounds to me like maybe not just accreditation for counseling, but just accreditation in general. So I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about that.
Yes. Well, when I started digging into how the field had gotten that way, I noticed that the accreditation bodies for these programs, which are national, were requiring a lot of this material. In particular, in part of the accreditation standard, it calls for the multicultural counseling to be infused, and they recently redid the standard, and they called for diversity, equity, and inclusion to be infused throughout the program. And the initial requirement was for all students to go through a multicultural counseling class. And that was something that had been presented to us very early on in the program, that when we got to that class, we could expect it to be really challenging, and that, most students had a really hard time with it. They brought in the prior year students to talk about some of that, and how they had shared a lot of personal information, saying that they knew each other's trauma and whatnot before they knew what somebody's favorite color was. And it was all framed as part of learning this multicultural counseling. And that was in the KCREP accreditation standard, which we had actually heard quite a lot about in class. And looking back on it, it's kind of weird. Why would you talk about the accreditor as much as they do in these classes? I never in my undergraduate, or we never talked about the accreditation bodies. what is it about that made it so that it matters so much that we're talking about it as part of our class coursework. And that was when I picked apart the standard and saw that they were requiring all of these things. And I had in my textbooks the multicultural sections. And that's when I started reading, and I started looking into the definition of the way that they were using some of these words. And I started to put together that what I would have assumed that they meant by multiculturalism would be, like to know some about the culture or the different cultures that make up our whole country. Like I have some Irish background and some English background and some Swiss background, and all of those, kind of come together in various parts of my family to, make what I'm living today. And there are other parts of my family that have, there's some background from China in there, other deep South background. And that's not what they mean. They don't mean that, you should know some about the cultural details. What they mean by culture is, what color are you? Are you able-bodied or not? Where do you feel about your gender? And it's all superficial stuff. Their whole idea of identity is bound up in what somebody can see when they look at you, not about what you care about or what your values are or your character. If you're, it doesn't matter if you are a liar or not a liar, or if you're sadistic or not sadistic. What matters are, well, what color you are. If we know what color you are, we can tell you all about yourself. And it was just absolutely reprehensible. Once I started to put together that that's what was happening, that's what they meant. That's what the indoctrination was.
Yeah, and so once you saw this like coming embedded into the accreditation standards, what were some of the things that you realized needed to be done to actually change this and change the field?
Well, the way that the accreditation standard works across the different universities, and this is increasingly happening, in my opinion, with most of the accreditors, is they're trying to homogenize the program. They're very specific about it in the KCREP accreditation because they talk about creating a professional counselor identity. And the idea is very much that we are going to take this person like they're a lump of clay, and we are going to model them into what we think of is the perfect professional identity, so that you can almost, be interchangeable. As long as you've been through the KCREP program, you've been through a process that makes you interchangeable as a counselor. And the idea being that any counselor can work with any client, and that there's, what you would think of as an actual person's identity doesn't matter, because you have this professional identity being put over you. And the idea was to make that homogeneous across all of the different programs. And a lot of this is really written out in the history. They say that this is what they want. We want there to be a consistent professional identity. And what that involves is, a curriculum that is the same in different places. And so they're using the accreditation standard to require the same things of all of the groups in the same ways, so that they can create the same product, which is this professional counselor identity person. And this is wildly unhealthy for so many different reasons. But the accreditation standard, because it is a requirement in order for people to get like Pell Grants and to get federally backed loans, it gives them the power to ask for and demand these things and to get them. Not as though most programs are really putting up a fight. It seems like a lot of times the professors say that they want this, and then it's like Brer Rabbit in the briar patch. Please don't make me have to do this, but that is what they want. And so it has become a pervasive problem over the entire country, but there's no oversight for the accreditors. So if you wanted to start a program where you weren't doing this, you couldn't get it accredited because you'd have to go through this process, which requires all of these other things. And there's not a way to go about addressing it. Like, you can't, there's not a police force that you can call up and say, these accreditors are really causing problems here. You can't talk to your senator. You can file some complaints with the Department of Education or with the FTC, where they have become monopolized. Like the American Bar Association is a monopoly accreditor. And KCREP is trying very hard to become a monopoly accreditor. And they even write that out, that they want KCREP to be the monopoly accreditor because they want to have this consistent professional counselor product. So if you don't like that, I don't like that. What that means is, to address that, changes need to be made in the law that make accreditation accountable. There will eventually need to be changes made in the federal law. Right now, it is easier to make changes in the state law, and that's what I'm working on here in Tennessee, is to create a structure and legal language that would allow the state attorney general to file suit against the accreditor when they do things that break Tennessee law or cause problems. Because otherwise, at the moment, a lot of these bodies, it's hard to find exactly. I mean, technically they're all nonprofits, but they're functioning more like regulatory bodies, but they're not technically regulatory bodies, and that makes it difficult to talk about. But it's not just difficult to talk about, it makes it difficult to actually hold them accountable, and that's the problem. But new changes in the law are out there that could make them more accountable on the state level. And hopefully things could happen, changes could be made at the federal level. I mean, I personally, at this point, I don't see what the benefit is in accreditation anymore. I think that it has been thoroughly corrupted and should go away at the federal level. Whatever that means, if we want to give money to students to go to school, we should find another way to do it rather than through a accreditor approved program.
Yeah. So one of the things that sticks out to me just being in the field, A is almost like a resignation of the totality of KCREP. Pretty much everyone says go to KCREP, and I feel like most of the people who, I went to NYU, which is an MPCAC school, and a lot of those people, I think, had a lot of frustration over the fact that they chose an MPCA school instead of a KCREP because of the licensure challenges that have kind of come related to the counseling compact. And that's definitely something I want to talk about. So both a kind of overarching resignation as to this is just how it is. And if you want to get licensed and have a career, then this is just what you have to do. I don't think there's a lot of consideration for quality or content or what it actually means to be KCREP accredited and what the requirements there are. And then also, people are kind of resigned, and I think there's a lack of awareness as to what K-CREP even means and like what it entails. So like I'm thinking, for example, of Grand Canyon University recently celebrated getting K-CREP accreditation for their school and clinical counseling programs. And they celebrated it, calling it or like relating it to their Christian faith and things like that. And like literally zero thought or concern at all as to what a K-CREP accreditation means at the practical level, which involves a ton of communist theory and practice, things that are like formally opposed to like I would say like an Orthodox Christian faith. And so everything is kind of thought about in like a very pragmatic way. Like this is going to get our students licensed and we'll be able to get all of these students through, get more students. So there's like a tuition motivation. All of the states like tend to be adopting K-CREP only as time goes on, specifically because of the counseling compact and things like that. So like basically my question is, like what do you think beyond like specific legislative things, like what needs to maybe change in the culture or the awareness within counseling to kind of make some of these shifts away from just kind of getting like funneled into this system?
Well, I think that one thing that people need to be aware of both parents and students, is that in its current form right now, higher education is really predatory. It's predatory on students. The tuitions are too high. The curriculum is indoctrinating, and they're not providing the actual education that students need when they come out the other end to do the jobs that they say that they can do. There's not really a connection there. It's, from the way that I see it, it is more about siphoning the tuition dollars and indebting students so that they can enjoy their, lifestyle, whether it is more so the administrators or the professors. They're all working together to maintain this very unhealthy system where you have young people who, we are all aware, have not really finished processing or growing their prefrontal cortex to understand the implications of signing up for tens of thousands of dollars in debt and, processing them through without providing them adequate skills. It's when you really step back and take a look at what's happening, it is, on that count, it is absolutely disgusting what's happening. And what needs to happen is, there's a couple of different ways to go about doing it. There's the fast way and the slow way. The slow way would be creating another accreditation body and, or bulking up MPCAC and trying to compete directly with K-CREP and try to get people on the licensing board for counselors in states that had counseling licenses that were different. They were ideologically different from K-CREP accredited graduates, and then it would involve fighting over what does it mean to be a counselor. Now, I think that the real, there's a lot of downsides to taking that path. And the biggest one is that it would be slow. It would take time to create a new accreditation body. You would have to find schools that would be willing to adopt your new standard. You'd have to go through a period where you create your own credibility so that you could be used. It probably wouldn't work very well at all if you didn't have at least one school that was willing to buy in on that count. And K-CREP has been pretty thorough here recently, trying to get more and more university programs signed up to their standard. Not only that, what would happen is once you were done, you would have to be able to distinguish, or clients would have to be able to distinguish what is a non-K-CREP counselor to a K-CREP counselor. So there'd be a lot of confusion in the marketplace for potential clients. Now, the faster way, and the way that I lean toward, would be creating a new professional body and be creating a new profession, new education standards. And I could even foresee a completely different way of arriving at a place where you decide that a person is qualified to start as a counselor. Right now, and this is just a general problem with accreditation standards, they're mostly focused on inputs. The idea being like we have all of this information and we're just going to shove it into these heads, and then they're going to be full of all of the right information, and then we can send them off to do their jobs. There are different ways that people can learn, and that's probably one of the worst ways that people can actually learn. There are also things that make somebody a good counselor that we really don't understand at the moment. There's a researcher by the name of Scott Miller who has done work with what he calls super therapists. And they are professionals that have far and away better outcomes from their clients than others do. And there needs to be more study into what's going on there and what it is that makes the difference. Is this something about a certain personality type that is a particularly good therapist? Is this something that people can learn to do? Maybe it's comes more natural for some people, but it is something that can be learned to do. And apply those things to what we're going to qualify as someone who is capable and ready to interact with clients. And it's just my personal opinion too. I think it would also be helpful if it was targeted more as a second career for a lot of people. Because, and maybe this is just my own personal bias because I'm coming at it at an older age, but when I come at it from an older age, I'm also coming at it with the life experience of having been through some very difficult experiences, and that would inform how any therapist approached things. And as someone who has gone to some older therapists and some younger therapists, there are some things that are just very difficult to work through with somebody who has never experienced it, just, is completely outside their experience. But I think that those would be what would be important to focus on and to dig more deeply into, and to start creating an entirely new profession and a new way to even think about educating for this profession, so that you could arrive at counselors that had life experience, understood psychology, real psychology, not what is currently being taught, and had the appropriate empathy to connect with other people, because it's really about connecting. And that's not something that you can necessarily, can and serve and deliver with a certain curriculum or textbook or whatever it is that you're trying to use as the vehicle to get that into students. That's something that has to be drawn out, and a little bit of it at least has to be present in the person already. And that's what I think would be the most productive path for people to take.
So I got a question maybe along those lines as well, and either one of you maybe can share thoughts on this if you'd like. So you have these programs set up that are basically indoctrinating the students into this worldview. What's on the other side of that in terms of employment opportunities, and where? I don't necessarily know. I mean, obviously, I know there's counselors in schools, and there's counselors in social work programs and, all these different things. But I don't know all the different opportunities for where counselors can work, and what are the expectations of these potential employers in terms of, do they have the expectation of this worldview being promoted within the jobs that students come out and enter into as well? So in other words, even if a few students are able to find their way through, or somehow make it through these indoctrination programs without being targeted and and they're able to and then go out into the workforce, are they then going to be faced with a similar situation when they get on the job somewhere? So I guess I don't know if how to address that are the employers looking for what the university programs are creating type of thing, or it would seem as somewhere there would have to be a disconnect if they weren't aligned in some way. So I'm just wondering maybe some thoughts on that, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So, I mean, I can just speak from experience. I mean, and also we have it's embedded in our ethics and our standards. So like even just having a state license, you're more or less expected to have these, as they would call it, professional dispositions. They would probably consider it a competency issue if you don't have the particular alignment. I'd also say it's cultural. So most people in the profession are already kind of in this culture, and this political culture specifically. So there is either explicit or implicit expectation that you're going to be aligned with it. There's of course ways of kind of going around it. I think people who are more established in the I'm an associate counselor, I have to be supervised. But if you don't have to be supervised and you could just kind of do your own practice, you probably have a little bit more flexibility there. But it is it's an overarching kind of thing. I do and maybe Suzannah also wants to answer this question, but I just want to follow from what she's saying and what you're saying, Paul, that it is an overarching problem, that it makes more sense to me to just start from the ground up, work from first principles and just build something new. What does it mean to be a counselor or a psychotherapist? And, how can we, what are we actually doing? I struggle a lot, specifically with the role of state licensing and whether it does more harm than good. And so I'm also curious, Suzannah, your thoughts on that too, is just, because I understand that there are people that need, there has to be some kind of checks and there has to be some kind of recourse, because there is serious dangers that are in the context of a therapeutic relationship where you can exert power and abuse somebody who's vulnerable. But at the same time, it adds a layer of concern for me that I haven't fully figured out what would be the best way forward. So I'm just wondering your thoughts on that.
Well, I would agree with all of that. And I never made it to my practicum, so I can't speak from direct experience, but I have heard from quite a lot of trainees that they are having to do that, talk about their privilege to clients as they are trying to start these relationships, as they get started. And a lot of tension out in the field of having to maintain these ideals, which they do not believe in, as they are starting their practices. So that is definitely a pervasive problem. And I've heard about that from trainees all across the country. And you're right to point out licensing, because licensing is the way that, once you get, I think a lot of people think that once they get out of grad school, maybe they can get out from under the ideology. But it is increasingly being required by the licensing boards. And as more and more programs are CACREP accredited, and you're turning out more and more CACREP accredited counselors, these spots are being filled by CACREP informed counselors, and that's who sits on licensing boards. I'm not sure how much people are aware of how licensing boards work, but basically what most states do is some profession will come to them and say, hey, we need licensing, to protect clients. It's usually sold as this is going to make the public safer. The way that it works out in practice is that it forms a professional cartel. And then it is your competitors that are telling you what you are allowed to do, because the states don't want to add to their bureaucratic load. In order for them to, fully back it, they would have to fund for the bureaucracy to support a licensing body. And they usually leave it to the professionals to police themselves. The idea being that, you have to be a professional in order to understand what is happening in these situations and to have an informed opinion about whether a professional is doing a good job or not doing a good job. In practice, that is not what you get at all. What you get is you get a group of professionals who are in the position of saying what new people have to do to be allowed to become their competitors. So licensing creates a ratchet effect. So once you have a group of professionals who are stable in their careers and they're on the licensing board, they can say, well, we think that for future people to join us, they need to have more school, or they need to have more classes, or they need to have this ideological material. On top of that, once somebody gets in, once you are finally accepted and you're licensed, then they are very ineffective at providing actual consequences when people step out of line. And it's as though the professionals sitting on the licensing board are over identifying with somebody who has committed what would otherwise be called malpractice. So you have people that are kind of waved on, even though they've done things that would be ethically outrageous from the public's point of view. And there's a really good book written about this called The Licensure Racket. I highly recommend it to people who are interested about that and how it is really not at all providing the protection that it is sold as to the public. But yes, the licensure piece, that component, helps to maintain this control over the profession. And it makes it impossible, well, not impossible, but it would make it very, very hard to try and change the profession internally. I think it's possible and it could be done, but it would be much easier to put together a new profession and to find a way to assure the public that what they were getting was good therapy. I mean, one of the things that I think is underutilized as an idea is the ways in which technology can add to that. If you think about, eBay has been around for 20 years now, and people go and they buy things off of eBay and they're relatively confident that they're going to get what they pay for. And that's because there is a reputational tracker of how people do their jobs. There's no reason that there couldn't be something very similar or identical to that would provide people looking for services an idea of the person that they are getting. Now, would that be a perfect solution? Of course not. There's not a perfect solution, but it would be one that would be more mediated by what a person was actually doing as a therapist. If you could look and see that they had, this person was great. They helped me. 5 stars. If you see a whole bunch of that, or conversely, if you see somewhere where, somebody is saying, a lot of people are saying that this person did a terrible job. I came out harmed from this situation. You would have a better idea of what it is that you were getting yourself into in starting. And it would also be an opportunity for a professional to, introduce themselves. I know a lot already do. They have their own websites and that sort of thing. But if it was more consolidated, say, for example, if there was a new professional body that was created for this new psychology profession, maybe part of what they would do would be to have their practitioners listed on a website where people could come and see what other people were saying about them, see what their clients were saying about them. I mean, one thing that you don't see in current things like health grades, you see feedback from past patients or clients, but you don't see endorsements for other professionals. So, like, you could have somebody who, say, for example, if they're working with the most difficult clients all of the time, it wouldn't be too surprising to see somebody that would have a lot of bad feedback. If your practice is made up entirely of people who are struggling with personality disorders, you might have a lot of bad feedback. But if your peers, other clinicians were saying, this person is absolutely the best for this, and create these different tiered reputations, more textured, I think that would be preferable. For me, it would definitely be preferable over this license, as though if they just have this piece of paper, well, of course they're good. Because all that really tells you, all the license really tells you, is that they've jumped through the required hoops to get there. It really doesn't tell you anything at all about them as a person or their educational history. I mean, I guess it tells you a little bit about that, but not really what they've learned, especially when all of these changes have happened on the back end in teaching programs. You don't really have an idea of what it is. They say psychology, but what counseling has become is obviously not psychology. So when those definitions are changing in the profession, it doesn't show up in the licensing, but you could see it in a more open sort of feedback system where clients and other professionals could provide their perspectives on how someone was doing. And, again, even sitting here thinking about it, there would be ways that the system would get distorted. And hopefully there would be adaptations through time that would help alleviate some of those problems. But you kind of have to start somewhere. And the system that we have right now is clearly not working.
Yeah. So, like, something that comes to my mind is how big of a business jumping through the hoops really is. Like, just the sheer amount of people that are graduating and passing these exams and getting licensed is a really huge business. I do want to talk briefly about the counseling compact, and I'll just briefly describe this kind of, I guess you'd call it like a nexus, or like a very specific body or group that has kind of almost total control in professional counseling. So that would be KCREP, which we've discussed, the American Counseling Association, the ACA, and the National Board for Certified Counselors, which is the NBCC. There's also Chi Sigma Iota, which is an honor society that Suzannah has written about. But so to give people a glimpse, and I'll just kind of use my experience as an example. So I went to an MPCAC school, but let's just say I went to KCREP. So you go through KCREP, and then you give your dues to the ACA. That's kind of standard, so that you can get things like insurance or continuing education credits and things like that. And then you also have the National Board for Certified Counselors, which does the National Counselor or National Certified Counselor certification. So if you ever see somebody who's a counselor and they have NCC after their name, that means they're a part of the National Board for Certified Counselors. The NBCC also does virtually all of the licensing exams. So I took the NCE in the state of Arizona. In the state of New York, it's the NH or NCMHCE. They're both put on by the National Board for Certified Counselors. So you have basically a monopoly there. So all of these hoops that people are jumping through very often are literally just like giving either the schools or these certifiers money and getting the check mark and kind of like getting put out. So I think like what needs to change, I mean, in terms of like the sheer amount of people coming out is naturally going to reduce the quality, and it's going to reduce pay. So I think that's something for people to be kind of considering, especially like if you are yourselves a professional counselor. So Suzannah, if you could share a little bit about the counseling compact and like specifically some of the legislative gray areas or the oversight gray areas that are kind of involved in that.
Well, what's interesting about the counseling compact, and I hope that more people will consider and take in, is that it is the way that it functions is as a contract between states. So you get different states agreeing to be part of this group. And it functions somewhat outside of the Constitution, because the Constitution doesn't say that states are not allowed to make agreements with each other. States are allowed to make agreements with each other. But once it gets put together in an entity, and that's what these agreements result in. So they create this agreement, and then they create an entity to administer this agreement. There's not a way to really legally go at problems that this agreement creates outside. So like if all the states agree, this is what we're going to do, we're going to share, we're going to allow people to work here or work there, but these are the restrictions that we're going to put on it. We're going to have them, they have to have this kind of education, and they have to, it could say anything, we can have them all hop on one foot, or, whatever it is that they decide is a requirement. It is not something that really can be pinged easily back to the Constitution and say, hey, this is unconstitutional, because it is outside of a lot of that law. It's in a very gray area. And that I'm aware of, there haven't been any legal challenges to what they're doing. So the way that plays out for practitioners in the field, and it matters for those who are MPCAC graduates. MPCAC, their standard can have as few as 45 credit hours to get the master's degree, which is a huge benefit to students who want to get in the field. And there's not a clear benefit to having 60 credit hours. In fact, I'm not sure that there's any data that shows that the additional credit hour requirement makes for better therapists. Yet the current version of the compact requires 60 credit hours. That's something that KCREP lobbied for. KCREP lobbied very hard for the counseling compact to be limited explicitly to KCREP accredited graduates. They wrote that. They had a whole open letter that they put on their website where they were calling out the ACA, because the ACA had been a little bit more flexible about it in some articles that they had printed in Counseling Today. And KCREP very much wanted it to be exclusive for KCREP accredited graduates. What has last I have looked into it, and there seems to be some fluctuating going on, but last I looked into it, it is 60 credit hours that they require, but it is not limited specifically to KCREP accredited graduates. But that does mean that any student who got a master's degree with an MPCAC accreditation with only 45 credit hours, they will not be welcome in the counseling compact. So they're basically frozen out of the profession, and I can't think of a pathway for them to really even complain. They might be able to file a suit, perhaps in Kentucky, because right now that's where it's been administered out of. But I'm not, I'm not even sure what sort of court they would be able to file a complaint under. They're just out of luck. And like, there's no, it's just clearly anti-competitive. It's anti-competitive. And a lot of this was, a lot of the lobbying that was done for the KCREP part, for that to be included as part of the counseling compact was done by Chi Sigma Iota. And they had many letters and that sort of thing where they went state by state to encourage things to be done to the KCREP standard. And there's not another organization really countering that. So all of the MPCAC graduates out there, unless there's some organization that I don't know of, they didn't really have a voice in the process, unless they were also members of the ACA and were actively trying to speak up about that. And that would be a very small number of people. And I think that is the real downside to a lot of these interstate compacts, is that once it is created and settled and is a matter of law, there's not really even a way to go back and make adjustments later on. I'm not even sure what sort of process it would take to get there. That might be something that would have to be fought for, and it might take a really long time to do that.
I appreciate you kind of walking us through that. So I'm just generally wondering, like, if you could give one piece of advice to, any professional counselor or psychotherapist who wants to get involved, especially at like the state level, in making some of these changes, what would you recommend?
Well, I think depending on whether you feel comfortable moving outside of professional bodies, I think that the best thing to do would be to start talking with other counselors who are also unhappy with the current situation, and find ways to create new professional bodies and start building a new profession, new name, new title, and move the work that you're doing just outside of the current framework, create a new designation. For people who are not ready for that, then they should be looking for opportunities to be on licensing boards, having at least some alternate perspective there. Right now, most licensing boards are a conduit for the leadership track of various professional bodies. So the way that might look is, if you were in graduate school and you were part of the Chi Sigma Iota, you're kind of people who joined that honor society are being tapped as future leaders of the profession. And those people go on to participate in leadership at the ACA. Working in the ACA, they come in contact with the licensure boards, and then they become tapped as people to be on the licensure boards. And the other organizations, they're tapped to be the new head of KCREP or the new head of the ACES organization. That's how these pathways to leadership flow. So what you would want to do is find a way to create another pathway to leadership in counseling, And you don't have to be part of the ACA or part of Chi Sigma Iota to be on a licensing board. You just have to be a leader and push yourself out there to find out what it takes to do it in your state and do it. That's what people need to do, is in their various state, is to step into these leadership roles. It doesn't matter if you don't feel fully qualified or whatever. Most folks are just making this stuff up anyway. And that's where you would actually have some sort of influence over whether or not they make further requirements to just enter the profession. Or you could also lobby if you didn't feel comfortable with that, you could lobby your state legislature to make it so that licensing boards have to have a higher number of regular citizens. It shouldn't be dominated by the profession, because the profession they're a biased opinion. Even though it's important to have their expertise, if it's dominated by the profession, all you've really successfully done is created a state-sanctioned cartel. And that does not help anyone except for the people who are trying to stifle competition.
Yeah, I appreciate all of that. Suzannah, you know that I'm kind of getting into local and state politics and things like that. And it is very difficult, especially if you don't have the natural personality for it. But I do think it's really important. And I think those are the areas where we can make small differences, especially at our various states. And before you know it, it just kind of expands. Before we end here, Paul, I'm just wondering if you have any last questions or what you've kind of taken from this conversation.
Yeah, man, I feel bad for people going into these programs. Suzannah, I feel bad for your experience that you had to go through. This is insane what's happening to people, to the like Suzannah, like what you said, these young kids coming into these programs, they don't have the life experience. They don't understand what these professors are doing to them. As far as I'm concerned, that's mental abuse. What's happening to these kids that are going into these programs, and then the financial abuse on top of that they're paying for it. They're paying to get mentally abused in these programs and come out and go into some of these jobs. This is completely insane. It's completely insane. I mean, I don't even know what else to say. I just feel bad for good people that are going into these programs for the right reasons, because they have a lot to offer to the counseling profession. Based on their personality, their upbringing, their life experience. Like Suzannah, what you said earlier, that there was even I guess some uncertainty as to how effective even some of these mental health programs are, even to get the results of good counselors. It seems like I'm sure there's something to do with it with good programs, but there's also something to do, I think, with maybe certain personalities that are drawn to it for the right reasons, and that have the life experience. And then obviously that study the theory behind it and the academics behind it, and have all of that knowledge to draw from to help people. But it's these kids are being mentally abused going through these programs, and then they're going into these professions where they're expected to continue to subjugate themselves to that ideology and to do the same to their clients, or at least kind of go along with it. Anyway, I cannot tell you how fired up this gets me, because not between what's happening in education and what's happening in the psychology programs or mental health programs, what's happening to people, it's the worst thing that can be going on. The abuse that's happening. It's terrible. But anyway. You asked, and that's my couple thoughts on that. But I mean, if you guys have anything else to say, before you wrap up, go ahead and do it. But before we do, I definitely want to get kind of your contact information in terms of social media or YouTube, Substack things, whatever, where people can find you, before we finish. And I will definitely put all that stuff in the description here so people will have those links as well. But yeah, go ahead, Katie.
Yeah, well, I mean, it really is insane, and I don't think like most people fully have processed the scale and the seriousness of what's going on. Paul, like how much I've talked about liberation and decolonial psychologies, and like the level of seriousness there that's just like totally flying over people's heads. It's like right in front of our faces, and so many people can't see it. It's a serious problem because these are real people who are going to counselors or various like professional psychotherapists asking for help, often at like a very vulnerable or low point at their lives. They might have issues with like connections to reality. Like there are so many different things that are going on there. And so putting people in that position who are either not qualified, undertrained, or are actively harmful because of, their adoption and practice of these ideologies, it's really quite something. Like I think if you really like think about it, it's like something that I think we haven't as a society, like the way that we have education, we haven't fully come around to what's going on and like how we need to prioritize and deal with it. Suzannah, do you have any like final thoughts or things that you think people should know about?
Well, I think the way that counseling is being taught right now, specifically with the training to turn the conversation around to issues of race and identity, I think that what is being taught is how to do malpractice. I don't think that these things are helpful. I think that, as it is being taught right now, I think that the programs are being set up in a predatory way. I think some more so than others, but a lot are just turning out graduates after graduates without there being a clear pathway for these people to work or to plug in that's going in a way that's going to be helpful for their communities. And and it's not just one of the things that I would hope that people would look more deeply in to see is that it is not just that this has happened all of a sudden. This has been an ongoing problem for 20 years. And it's not just that they've changed the material, they have actively changed the pedagogy in order to make it more pressurizing to get people to adopt these beliefs. Some of the work that I've done here recently is on a pedagogy style called the pedagogy of discomfort, which actively shows how to do things, talks about how to do things like what I experienced, how to speak personal details about your life in front of the group. And that theory came out in 1999. This has been deeply embedded in this university or academic culture for a long time. And all of this, whenever you have a pedagogy that encourages what I would call humiliation, you're not just degrading the professional material, you're degrading the entire society that orbits around it, because you're showing that from that what should be a very protected relationship where a professor is teaching students how to do something, there's a vulnerability there, there's a power imbalance there, and it's being abused. You're putting cohort after cohort through an abusive process. Even if they never work in the profession, there's no way that can't bleed out into the culture at large and change how we treat each other. It's like it's beyond anything that I think would even be okay. And that's why I'm doing what I'm doing, because this has to be stopped. Somebody has to say no, and I'm saying no. And I just hope that other people will join me and will work on efforts that will help put an end to this kind of thing, because it needs to stop.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. Thank you so much for your time today. Thank you for all of the work in general that you're doing. I really think you're pioneering something incredibly important. Can you tell people where they can find you and your work?
Mhm. Across the internet, you can mostly find me as Diogenes in Exile. That's the name of my Substack, Diogenes in Exile. My X, formerly Twitter handle, is Diogenes in Exile. And my YouTube channel is also Diogenes in Exile. So if you see that, this is probably me.
Great. All right. Well, thank you so much. And thank you, Paul, for having us on, your YouTube and letting us have this conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you for having this discussion, and for both of your continued efforts on trying to raise awareness about this stuff. It's hugely important. So thanks a lot for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.